Hi there, it's Leandra here from PaperArtsy, and today I'm going to show you a kind of an abstract way to use grunge paste, paint and a few stamps and other bits and pieces. Once again I'm working on this canvas board. It's like a chipboard coated with canvas. So if you don't have canvas boards, they're also quite easy to make. If you've got regular canvas off the roll, you can easily apply it to any shaped chipboard and create your own canvas board quite simply. It's nice if you do it that way as well, because you can end up with quite ragged edges, it's fun and adds a little bit of an extra dimension rather than this sort of quite commercial smooth looking option. So I'm not entirely sure quite where I'm heading with this today, but I want it to be overall quite an abstract piece. And the aim is that I'm going to use a grunge paste to smooth off the texture of the canvas, because sometimes when I'm working on a project, I like to be able to stamp images, stamp something like that on here, and of course when you've got the texture of the canvas, it's just too lumpy for you to be able to stamp something like a quote. The aim is to be quite abstract, but also to eliminate the texture of this canvas produces. Now, first up, I'm going to mix up these 4 different colours with grunge paste so that the grunge paste is tinted, and then I'm going to start applying them randomly and build up sort of like patches of different textures. So when you're adding your paint to your grunge paste, this one's Spacecadet, you don't need a lot of paint to be able to tint it. I'd probably err on the side of caution, maybe just 1 or 2 drops. You can always add more. You don't want to get yourself in a situation where you make it too sloppy, particularly if you're using it through a stencil. If you make it too sloppy and you put it through a stencil, that's when your product will be more likely to seep underneath the stencil. So if you're applying it direct to the surface like today, then obviously it can be a bit looser, but it's just a bit of trial and error. So we've got Sage, Lake Wanaka, Spacecadet, and that is stone. It looks very similar. It's slightly darker than the natural colour of the grunge paste. Now if this is going to take some time to use, you might want cling film nearby so that you can cover it, because obviously it does dry out quite quickly. Okay, so like I said earlier, I really don't know quite where I'm going with this, but I've got a loose idea in my head. I've marked on the canvas the shapes of some quote stamps that I think I might stamp into grunge paste. So that's the position of where they're potentially going to end up. So I'm putting them to one side, but I kind of feel like I need to do that very last, because if I put the grunge paste down now and stamp into it, as I build up other colours of grunge paste on the canvas, I'm quite likely to bump that. So I kind of figure that's going to be the last step. So what I'm trying to do is build up sections or patches of grunge paste that's tinted on the canvas here, and some of them I might sort of stamp into them and others I might not. So I'm just going to see what happens. So I thought if I applied this with the back of a piece of cut and dry foam, I would get quite a bit of control over the depth of the grunge paste, and also it's quite nice and smooth, which creates a good surface for stamping into. When you apply this, if you're going to stamp into it, you don't want it to be too thick. Otherwise you'll just create a squidgy mess when you stamp into it. Now I'm a bit of a one for building areas up step by step and trying to balance the one colour that I'm working on at a time. So if I just put the Sage on in a few places to begin with, and then start doing the same with other colours, and then the idea is that I'm going to start texturizing each of these patches in a different method. So let's texture this one. If I've got words there, I probably don't want words right next to it. So one way to texture this is just to use the back of the foam and create sort of a suction action, so that you get a kind of different texture. Okay, that's one. Another idea I had was perhaps making lines or marks into it. So if there's a font going that direction, I could do it this way going in a different direction. Don't know what I'm doing, just random little squiggly marks. Sort of handwriting, but kind of not. But it's just to make some sort of texture or mark on there. Right, if I want to stamp into it, I just have to be careful that it's not too dry, and of course it does dry out quite quickly. So that sort of feels okay. And if the words are here and here and here, then there's no words there, which means perhaps I could stamp something in with that. So if I go to this one, it's quite a small area. And whenever you stamp into Grunge Paste, you just want to make sure that your stamp is damp but not sopping wet. Okay, and that gives you quite a nice texture using the script. So this one here, I wondered, so that's kind of going in that direction, that's going that way. Why don't we do something like... Okay, so I've done that with a bit of sage. Now I'm going to attempt the same thing with a different colour and just try and build up all of these sections. Now if your grunge paste that you've already built up on the side is starting to get a bit sticky and a bit too dryish, then you can always loosen it with more paint. Or even a spritz of water should be okay. I kind of think when you're doing something like this, you probably don't want to have too many colours introduced. So just sort of choose your colour palette at the beginning. I've chosen soft colours. And I think too that it's probably quite good to have some blank areas where you don't necessarily texturize every single section. Now if you want your grunge paste to be really, really smooth, one of the things you can actually do is spritz it with water and then just sort of use your finger to smooth it out a little bit more. And that will dry to a much smoother slick, which can be quite cool. If I fill in that whole section there, then that leaves me that area for another colour. So let's go back to our texturizing concepts. Let's see, I've probably not got it on thick enough on any of those colours to stamp into it. I can give it a go. So it's just a matter of repeating the concept each time in the other colour, in a new colour. Okay, Spacecadet. And if that plan doesn't work, then we're just going to have to figure out a plan B and perhaps not stamp the stamps into it this time round. Because I had another idea that what I might do is come over the top of some of these blocks using a stencil. So for example, a script stencil like this over the top would also give a similar effect. So what I'm going to do is bend the stamp to just get a section of script down the centre there, that tiny little bit there. Okay, so what I've created now is a kind of an abstract block of various different textures. So what I was going to do next was dry all this off and then decide if I need to add more interest by perhaps coming over the top with other layers of very translucent colour to just add a bit more interest and depth. So I'll go away and dry this off and we'll come back in a minute. Now, one of the things I just want to point out, I don't know if you can see this, but on the ones where I added extra water, one of the things that sometimes happens to the grunge paste is that it starts to, as you add water, it dries at different rates. So it, as the water dries off, you start to get this almost crackle effect in the grunge paste, and if you use a heat gun on top of that, it seems to accelerate it a little bit. So that can be an interesting effect if you're using a large area of grunge paste and then you spritz it with lots of water. Sometimes you get this sort of really unusual crackle effect. Okay, this is all dry now, and you can kind of see some of the cracks that have turned up in the two layers that were really smooth. The decision now is perhaps whether we run a wash of colour over the top, and there's two ways you could go. If you take something like this, a taupe, and put that over the top, a really watery layer of it, then it's going to highlight all the texture quite nicely. Or you could go the other way where you would use a lighter shade, like something like stone again, or perhaps snowflake, and it would amalgamate all these layers where they wouldn't, the colours would look a bit more blended and less patchworky. So that decision is still to come. This background idea is something that's ideal for you to go on and make other layers. You could use it on a scrapbooking paper. You can use it on, obviously, like we have here, on canvas or whatever. Now, as luck would have it, I stumbled across this, which is another canvas board, and I cut a heart out, which I've got another project in mind for. So I figured that this would actually make quite a good frame over the top of the heart. So I mucked about a little bit and painted the whole thing stone, and then I came over the top with just a random little bit of texture through the stencil. This is a Crafters Workshop stencil, and it's called Art Is, and I use it a lot because I love the script layers. So I've just randomly used little bits of the stencil, and I put the grunge paste, I mixed it with mud splat so that it's a slightly darker shade. Then I've just edged the very edges, the inside of the heart, and dry brushed with snowflake over the top to just lighten it back a little bit. And so now I think the decision is clear that perhaps I should use taupe on this lower layer to link the two colours together, where I've got the sort of taupey browny shades in the top. I think if I sort of really put a watery wash of taupe over there, it will link the two, but I'll still see all these great colours and the patchwork. Now the cool thing is, of course, you can just rotate your canvas until you decide which section you prefer the most to use, because it's abstract and it doesn't particularly have any orientation. So that's quite cool, and then you can pick out bits and pieces, but I think that's worked quite well. So let's just run a quick wash of taupe over the top, and this can be quite a scary thing for a lot of people. But if you water it down loads, then it's a lot less scary. And the other option too is, I don't know if I've got much in here, but you can always dampen the canvas off before you start as well, and that will help. So I want that to be really watery. I'm just going to get some more water so that that's really, really loose. And then it's a good idea to have a baby wipe handy, because if it gets a bit if you get too much on there and it freaks you out a bit, then you can just use a baby wipe straight away. So we'll put that on, and then you see you just dab at it with a baby wipe so that it knocks it back a bit. So it's not a permanent thing if you work quite quickly with your baby wipe. then you've got control. It's much easier the wetter that it is. And then just slightly tap at it until you get it looking how you want. Okay, so see, it gives it a bit more of a shabby chic look. And if you don't want that much on there, if it's still too much, you just get a bit more vigorous with the baby white. It's less obvious now, but it's still toned it in with that top layer. So now I'm just going to use a heavy structured gel to stick these layers together. When I'm using a gel like that, I'm usually want to be quite generous with it. So layer this on, and it will take overnight to dry, but it will never come apart. The two layers won't fall apart. Heavy structure gel is much thicker than a regular gel medium, and really what its purpose is so that you can tint your paint but give structure. So perhaps for traditional fine artists, they might want to be adding texture to the sea or clouds or something like that. So they use the gel to tint their paint and change the viscosity of the paint. But the great thing about gels is they can also be used as an adhesive. And because they are a fine artist product, they are UV friendly. And so if you hang something like this on the wall, it's never going to yellow and fall apart. Whereas if you use something like a PVA or Mod Podge is PVA based, it will always go yellow and eventually it will just stop, it will just fall apart. So I quite prefer to use artist gels when it comes to, you know, something sticking layers together. And then I've just got any glue that seeps through. Perhaps I'm not pressing down on it because I just want it to sit there. It's in contact, so that's it. I'm not going to actually press down and squidge it anywhere. So that's fine, but if you can see any areas where it has squidged through, then just take a damp brush and remove. And that should all be set up. So there you go. Pretty cool project, just using texture and making something quite abstract using your stamps, grunge paste and your paint.